diving in today, we're tackling Bretton Woods.
Oh, yeah, Bretton Woods.
Super important topic. I mean, not just for UPSC folks out there, but I think for anyone who wants to kind of get how the world economy works,
For sure.
Imagine no World Bank, no IMF. Like,
Yeah.
how did we get here?
Yeah.
That's what we're looking at. We've got some excerpts from a pretty in-depth academic text. It really breaks down the whole thing. Origins, motivations, all the big players at Bretton Woods.
Yeah, got to look at the context too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like 1944, the world's still recovering from, well, everything. The Depression, World War II.
Right, that feeling of like never again.
Exactly.
Our source, it really emphasizes that point, especially when they talk about those bigger thy neighbor policies from the 30s.
Yeah.
So for anyone who might not remember those, can you remind us, what were those policies and why they backfire so badly?
Basically, imagine every country for themselves during the Depression. They're raising tariffs like crazy, devaluing their currencies, all trying to make their stuff cheaper, other countries' stuff more expensive.
Yeah, right.
The problem is everyone's doing it. So what happens? Global trade just tanks even harder. I mean, it was a mess, made the Depression even worse. And I think it's that experience that really hits home for these leaders at Bretton Woods. Like, we need a system. We need to work together.
Right. So enter Bretton Woods, right? This big gathering, all these world leaders trying to figure out, like, how do we rebuild? And from that, you get the institutions we still have today, right? The IMF, the World Bank.
Yep.
And even though it came a bit later, GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
Which later became the WTO.
Exactly, the WTO.
Huge.
And, it's a multilateral effort for sure. But let's be real. The U.S. coming out of the war as this superpower, they had pretty big say in things.
Oh, absolutely. They were very deliberate about shaping the agreement to fit their goals.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a lot at stake, especially with, communism on the rise. So it wasn't just like global kumbaya, right?
Yeah.
They had their own agenda.
Definitely.
So how did that actually play out in the agreement? What were they really aiming for?
Well, first and foremost, they wanted to keep their economy booming, like keep that wartime growth going and avoid another depression at all costs.
Right.
And that meant free trade, open markets for American goods, all while, of course, maintaining their position as the top dog economically.
Okay, so that's the why behind the U.S. involvement. But how did that translate into the actual mechanics of the Bretton Woods system? How did it actually work?
Well, the heart of it was this new monetary order. They wanted to stabilize global currencies. And they did that by pegging everyone to the U.S. dollar.
So the dollar's like the anchor.
Exactly. And the dollar itself was tied to the price of gold.
Interesting. So it's all kind of connected back to this one thing.
Right. It created a system where currencies had fixed values, making international trade and finance a lot more predictable.
So, like, imagine the dollar is this big, solid ship, and all the other currencies are like smaller boats tied to it. As long as that big ship's steady, the smaller ones benefit from that stability.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
But, I mean, was everyone on board with this? I know you mentioned John Maynard Keynes earlier. He had some different ideas, right?
He did.
I remember studying him for my UPSC exams.
Oh, yeah.
Can you remind us what was his proposal and why didn't it fly?
Yeah, so Keynes, representing the UK, he was pretty bold. He wanted to create this global bank that would issue its own currency.
Currency, whatever.
Yeah, it's called the Bancor. And this system would have included ways to balance out trade. So countries with huge surpluses would share some responsibility for keeping the global economy healthy.
Interesting.
Yeah. It was less about one dominant currency and more about shared responsibility.
But it didn't happen.
Right. The U.S., they weren't too keen on giving up their power or having their economic policies dictated by some international body, so they pretty much shut it down.
So in the end, we got a system that really reflected U.S. interests.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's fascinating, It's like, even when you're talking about international cooperation, you can't escape those national
Oh,
interests.
absolutely. And understanding those dynamics is key to really getting how the global economy works, especially for those UPSC exams.
Right, yeah. All right, so picking up where we left off with Bretton Woods, we talked about uh, context, the whole agreement, how it came together. But I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, embedded liberalism.
Right, right.
What is that exactly?
Yeah, it's a big idea for sure, but it's really key to understanding the thinking behind Bretton Woods. Basically, it's this mix of free markets with a bit of government intervention thrown in.
Okay, so not like pure laissez-faire, hands-off capitalism,
Exactly.
but something a bit more, I don't know, like managed.
Yeah, you could say that. The idea was to get the benefits of free trade, open markets, but also recognize that, hey, we need some safeguards, some rules to make sure things don't go completely haywire like they did in the 30s, prevent another depression.
Right, right.
So it's about finding that balance.
Which, I mean, that sounds tricky, right? Balancing those two things, free markets and stability?
Oh, for sure. And it's a debate that's still going on today, right? But for a while, Bretton Woods, it kind of worked.
Yeah. But you mentioned there were criticisms. Like we talked about Keynes and his different vision.
Mm-hmm.
Were there other concerns, even from the start?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, even Keynes thought the agreement gave too much power to creditor nations, like the U.S., right? Which could lead to problems down the line. And over time, you saw those concerns. They started to get louder, especially from developing countries.
They felt kind of left out.
Yeah, a lot of them did. They felt like their voices weren't being heard in the big institutions like the IMF and World Bank.
So even though Bretton Woods was all about, international cooperation,
Yeah.
there were still these like power imbalances baked in, almost like those bigger than ever policies, but maybe a bit more subtle this time around.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it raises some big questions about, how much has really changed. How do we make global economic governance truly fair and equal?
Big questions. And then, of course, there was the whole issue of the U.S. dollar being the center of everything.
Right.
That had to give them an advantage.
For sure. I mean, having the dollar as the reserve currency, it let the U.S. run these huge trade deficits and basically export their inflation problems to other countries.
So not exactly a level playing field.
No, not really. And this created a lot of tension, and eventually it contributed to the whole system breaking down.
Okay, so we've got these tensions, these criticisms, but for a while, Bretton Woods held up, right? When did things really start to unravel?
Well, the 70s were pretty rough. You had inflation in the U.S., their trade balance was getting worse, the Vietnam War was costing a fortune.
Wow.
All of that put a ton of pressure on the dollar. And trying to keep it tied to gold, it wasn't working anymore.
I'm guessing this is where Nixon comes in.
Bingo. 1971, Nixon takes the U.S. off the gold standard. Just like that, the fixed exchange rate system, the core of Bretton Woods, it's gone.
Wow. So, like our big ship analogy, the dollar,
Mm-hmm.
just cuts the ropes and sails off on its own. What happened then? Did everything just, explode?
Well, it was definitely a bumpy ride. We moved to these floating exchange rates, so now currency values are determined by the market, and that brings its own set of challenges, right? But it also gives you more flexibility. You can adjust to changing economic conditions more easily.
So a trade-off.
Yeah.
More risk, but more adaptability.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the Bretton Woods institutions? Did they just disappear?
No, they're still around, but they had to change with the times. The IMF, for example, they shifted focus. Instead of just managing exchange rates, they're now dealing with bigger issues like financial crises, debt, poverty.
So more versatile, more focused on the problems of today's world.
Exactly. The Bretton Woods institutions, they're still major players in the global economy, even though their roles have shifted quite a bit.
Right. But I know there's been a lot of debate about whether they're actually effective, especially for developing countries.
Yeah.
Some people argue they've done more harm than good. What do you think?
It's tough to say, honestly. It's complicated. I mean, they've been criticized for pushing policies that haven't always worked out for developing countries, for being too influenced by powerful nations.
Right, so that question of power, who benefits, it's still there.
It is, and it's led to calls for reform, for more accountability.
So we've got this legacy of Bretton Woods institutions that are still around, but the system itself, it's fundamentally changed.
That's right.
What does that mean for us today? Is Bretton Woods, is it even relevant anymore?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, the fixed exchange rate system is gone, but the institutions, the ideas, they're still shaping how the global economy works.
All right, final part of our Bretton Woods deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the agreement itself to the end of those fixed exchange rates.
Mm.
But I think the big question now is, like, where do we go from here? If Bretton Woods, at least how it was originally set up, isn't the answer for the global economy, what are the alternatives? What else is out there?
Yeah, that's a question more and more people are asking, especially now. I mean, one of the biggest criticisms of Bretton Woods, like we've been talking about, is that it kind of reinforces those power imbalances, you know?
Yeah.
So you see this push for a more multipolar world.
A multipole.
Yeah, like spreading the economic power around more evenly, not just concentrated in a few countries.
So moving away from like a U.S.-centric system to something more, I don't know, more representative of how things are today. Are there any real-world examples of what that would look like?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You see these new institutions popping up, like the BRICS Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Right.
They're challenging the traditional players, the IMF, the World Bank. They offer different ways to finance development, and they represent, a shift in the balance of power.
It's like the old guards facing some competition.
Yeah, you could say that.
And you mentioned alternative economic models earlier. Like, what are people talking about?
Well, there's a lot of buzz around models that focus on sustainability, social well-being, not just growth for the sake of growth.
Okay.
Stuff like the circular economy, degrowth, donut economics. They're questioning that old assumption that we just need to keep growing forever, no matter the cost.
Right. It's about like a more balanced approach, right? Thinking about the environment, social impact.
Exactly. And the thing is, the future of the global economy, it's not set in stone. We all have a say in it.
It's up to us to shape it.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this Bretton Woods deep dive, what's the main takeaway for our listeners, especially for those UPSC folks out there?
I think the big lesson is this. Bretton Woods, it was a huge turning point. It was this attempt to build a better world after all that chaos. And even though the system itself has changed a lot, those institutions, those ideas, they're still with us.
Yeah. It's a complicated legacy, right? There were good things, but also problems, criticism.
For sure.
And being able to see that, to understand the nuances, the power dynamics, that's what's important for anyone who wants to get how the global economy really works.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And at the end of the day, it reminds us that history, it's not just about the past, It's about understanding where we are now and where we're going.
Totally. So to everyone listening, whether you're prepping for your UPSC exams or just, curious about the world, we hope this deep dive gave you some food for thought.
It's been great diving deep with you all.
And before we go, check out those sources we mentioned. If you want to learn more, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this with your friends. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.